Hello and welcome back to lecture number 74. You did it. This is the last lecture for period 7, and we're going to take a look at the entire period and find areas for comparison in period 7. That is our learning objective for today. Compare the relative significance of major events of the first half of the 20th century in shaping American identity. So that's one thing that we're going to continue to go back to in each of these slides is how these events are shaping American identity. And we're starting with growth and reform. So growth expanded opportunity while economic instability led to new efforts to reform US society and its economic system. So the economic growth of the roaring 1920s dominated the American identity, even though most people were not experiencing that economic expansion. Farmers and minorities did not share that same expansion in wealth and prosperity. But we still look back on this period as a time of wealth and fashion and spending money and flappers. We also have America identity shifting as a result of the progressive era. So people are asking for more from their government and reforms for prohibition, women's suffrage, direct election of senators. We'll look at some anti-corruption and antitrust reforms in a later slide. So now people are looking to their government to do more, and that's becoming ingrained into American identity. So for urbanization, the United States continued its transition from a rural agricultural economy to an urban industrial economy led by large companies. So the urban experience of people living in a large city tied closely to factory and wage labor. In the picture that you see above is the city of Chicago, one of these large and bustling cities of the Midwest during the early 20th century. But in addition to the economic opportunities, there's also crowded conditions in the city. There's more immigrants, and there are expansion of some services. So education, there's public education provided to all young people in the cities. It's much more widespread than it is in the rural areas. The rural areas, it's more sparsely populated. Farmers are entering into the cycle of debt that was created by a growth of supplying crops and a decreasing demand for those crops. That's a result of World War I when they increased production of their crops so that they could feed Europe. And then as soon as the war started, they had all this surplus that drove their prices down. And instead of limiting their production to try and get out of debt, they tried to produce more and more, which drove prices down even further. Later on in the 1930s, the Dust Bowl is going to ravage the Midwest, the Great Plains, and some of the farmers that are there are going to lose all of their crops. They're not going to be able to continue to farm in that area because the soil has lost all its nutrients. It's turned to very fine, sandy dust, and it's not going to yield any crops, forcing those people to move to urban areas. In the progressive era of the early 20th century, progressives responded to political corruption, economic instability, and social concerns by calling for greater government action and other political and social measures. So this goes along with what we talked about earlier about how Americans are now asking of their government greater responsibility for protecting American consumers and American workers. So now we are more likely to be on the side of the worker and the consumer than we were in the Gilded Age. In the Gilded Age, we were more on the side of the captains of industry or robber barons, depending on your point of view. We looked at them and respected them for all of the wealth that they were able to achieve, and we saw that as a sign of ingenuity. Now, in the early 20th century, there are regulations and legislation that is being strengthened to tear apart those monopolies and trusts and horizontally integrated companies that had been gouging their consumers, their customers, for every last cent. So that's the Sherman Antitrust Act. There's regulations on the meatpacking industry. The FDA is created. There's municipal government reforms to try and root out corruption in city governments. So some cities switch over to the council manager system or the commissioner system, in which people are trained in managing local government and they are given the positions to manage local government as opposed to people who are elected based on their charisma. There's calls for minimum wage and maximum working hour legislation, which will very slowly come as the decades progress. So during the 1930s, policymakers responded to the mass unemployment and social upheavals of the Great Depression by transforming the U.S. into a limited welfare state, redefining the goals and ideas of modern American liberalism. So the Great Depression, more than any other economic event in American history, shaped American identity. That is because the widespread unemployment that was up to 25% touched 1 out of every 4 households. Everyone knew someone that had been affected, had lost their jobs, had lost their savings as a result of the bank runs that came with the Great Depression. So people did not see unemployment and poverty as a personal or moral failing anymore. They saw it as a crisis that was nationwide, that was hard to control or hard for one person to change. And again, it's shaping Americans' view of the government and their role in a crisis such as this one. Whereas in the previous decades, people would have said to those who were in poverty or unemployed that they just needed to pick themselves up by the bootstraps and have a little bit of self-reliance. That was not working in the Great Depression anymore. It didn't matter how much someone wanted to work. If the jobs were not available, then people were not able to work. And when FDR is elected into office in 1932 and he begins the New Deal in his first 100 days, it again is changing the role of the government and its responsibilities in a large crisis like this one by putting in place programs that are going to create those jobs that people want and to create that social safety net in the form of Social Security for people who are over the age of 65 or become unemployed. The only other comparable event that is close to touching the Great Depression would be the Panic of 1893. Again, that lasted about 3 years back in the 1890s, and there was some runs on the banks. The nation's gold supply was being depleted, but it definitely was not as widespread as the Great Depression. The Great Depression was also exacerbated by the effects of the Dust Bowl in the Great Plains. All right, innovations in communication and technology contribute to the growth of mass culture, while significant changes occurred in internal and international migration patterns. The radio, as a new technology, spread regional culture nationwide more than any other invention. The next one would probably have been the Model T Ford, because it allows people to move from one place to another relatively more quickly than before. But for transportation, the trains were starting to be a lot more standardized and a lot more widespread. But really, people are able to turn on the radio and listen to country music that's coming out of Tennessee, and people are saying, oh, you know what, I think I like this country music, I want to hear more of it. And so the radio stations that were owned by ABC or CBS started to broadcast national programming to the whole country, really building on that national identity. As a part of this, for internal migration patterns, we have the first and the second Great Migration. African Americans are leaving the South in large numbers, first as a result of leaving discrimination, Jim Crow laws, and partly to take up jobs during World War I in the northern cities. Then again in the second Great Migration as a result of the war mobilization effort for World War II. There are more African Americans from different parts of the country congregating in closer knit communities because of the nature of an urban area, and exchanging ideas, exchanging different art forms. And from the first Great Migration, we get the Harlem Renaissance. Langston Hughes, seen on the slide here, is one of the major figures of the Harlem Renaissance. Popular culture grew in influence in the United States society, even as debates increased over the effects of culture and public values, morals, and American and national identity. So we have these two competing ideologies for American national identity. The first one is modernism, and that comes with everything that is new. So we see this in art and fashion, reliance on new technologies and discovery, and people begin to think that everything that is new, everything that is flashy and nice is where American identity should go, and that's how it should continue to progress. There are some downfalls to this way of thinking. For one, the new modernist ideas also used social Darwinism quite heavily, which was a discriminatory form of looking at a hierarchy of races. And also, with this new over-reliance on science, we're able to create these great new inventions, but some of these new inventions, like the atomic bomb, are really destructive, and they led to the death of 250,000 Japanese civilians in the middle of World War II, or at the end of World War II. For conservatism, the counterforce to modernism is seen in the growth of fundamentalist Christianity. They're looking at everything that is in the Bible and they're taking it literally. And because things like evolution are not mentioned specifically in the Bible, they're saying this cannot be the case, this cannot be true, and it's not something that we want to teach in schools. And that's where we get the Scopes monkey trial from, with John Scopes, a biology teacher in Tennessee, being charged with the crime of teaching evolution in his classroom. All right, economic pressures, global events, and political developments caused sharp variations in the numbers, sources, and experiences of both international and internal migrants. So for internal migrants, we have some push factors for African Americans because of the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan, partly as a result of D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, that full-length movie in which a Klansman is played as the protagonist. We have a continuity from the previous period of lynchings of African Americans. Remember, this is the work that Ida B. Wells was really trying to bring to the national spotlight and try to get a federal lynch law passed, which unfortunately does not get taken up by Congress or the president in this period. Segregation is still prevalent. We have segregated units in war. In World War I, a great example of that is the Harlem Hellfighters. In World War II, we have the Tuskegee Airmen. All of them served with distinction, and they were given many medals for their courage in war. And even that was not enough to convince the armed forces to integrate during the two wars, World War I and World War II. It won't be until 1948, so we'll be talking about this in the next historical period, in which President Truman says that we should integrate the armed forces. International migrants. There was a backlash against immigrants after World War I and World War II. As a result of the Red Scare, people were fearing communism. So that's going to happen after World War I, and it's going to happen at even a greater level in World War II. There's going to be these communist witch hunts, and we'll talk about those in the next historical period, with Senator Joseph McCarthy leading the hunt. And we have further restrictions on immigration. So nativists who were looking for restrictive legislation all through the late 1800s and early 1900s finally get their wish with the 1921 and 1924 Quota Acts, in which eventually every country across the Eastern Hemisphere will have their numbers of immigrants allowed into the U.S. to go down to 2% of what they were in the 1890 census. So it's a huge reduction of immigration from the Eastern Hemisphere. However, the Western Hemisphere countries of Latin America are still able to go back and forth and immigrate to the United States. All right, participation in a series of global conflicts propelled the U.S. into a position of international power while renewing domestic debates over the nation's proper role in the world. I've listed the three major wars that we fight in this period here: the Spanish-American War, World War I, and World War II, and how each of them are going to shape American national identity and how we see ourselves and our place in the world. After the Spanish-American War, we are a large global power because we have just defeated another large global power in Spain. With World War I, we leave the war with, again, being the strongest country on earth. We didn't experience any of the destruction of the war here at home. We were able to gain a lot of economic wealth by mobilizing for the war. And instead of owning that new identity of being a world power, we retreat into isolationism. With World War II, our isolationism is burst open and we have to go and fight the war, especially after we've been attacked at Pearl Harbor. And instead of choosing isolationism at the war's end, we engage with the rest of the world in this global cooperation. We join the United Nations. We help European countries recover and rebuild after the war, mostly because we want to keep communism out of those countries that experienced the destruction. All right, in the late 19th century and early 20th century, new U.S. territorial ambitions and acquisitions in the Western Hemisphere and the Pacific accompanied heightened public debates over America's role in the world. So the debate here is, should the United States be an imperialist country? Should we intervene in the affairs of other countries, or should we isolate ourselves and stay away? So the arguments for intervention was that the belief in the responsibility of the United States to civilize these lesser people abroad. If you remember back to the poem The White Man's Burden by Rudyard Kipling, it expresses this point of view that the United States has a burden that it must go out and civilize or Christianize the people abroad. In regards to World War I, we wanted to go out and protect the freedom of the seas. And in World War II, we wanted to go out and aid allies in fighting against tyranny. So as a result of these wars, the United States may gain a territorial gain. So as a result of the Spanish-American War, we get Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, and the United States should be able to keep them, according to those who are imperialist or interventionists. Arguments for isolation was similar to that in the interventionists, that they believed that foreigners were uncivilized, and so therefore we should not associate ourselves with them, that they would make us in some way uncivilized. For those who wanted isolation, in the face of World War I, was that they didn't want to fight a senseless war, a war that had been started over the assassination of an archduke that most Americans had no idea who he was, and somehow that involved the fighting of Britain, France, and Germany, even though Britain, France, and Germany were not actually involved in the assassination of the archduke. And then finally, for those who wanted to remain isolated in the face of World War II, they said that the U.S. has no place in European matters and that they should focus on the Western Hemisphere. If you remember the advocacy of Charles Lindbergh and the America First Committee, they wanted the United States to focus on themselves, build their defenses, and keep anyone from even thinking that it would be a good idea to invade the United States. All right, so World War I and its aftermath intensified ongoing debates about the nation's role in the world and how best to achieve national security and pursue American interests. So entering the war, Woodrow Wilson, the president, had to do some serious convincing to the American people that it was a good idea to enter into the war. So he was really concerned about the unrestricted submarine warfare that the Germans were carrying out across the Atlantic. And so he says that the world must be made safe for democracy, that we should have freedom of the seas and neutral countries should be able to go back and forth and trade with whomever they want. And so therefore, we must enter the war. And American safety was being threatened by this foreign war, and so therefore we had to do something about it. At the end of the war, the United States was in a different mindset. They saw the destruction that came with World War I. They saw that it was pretty senseless in how it began. And so therefore we should not tie ourselves to European allies, because who knows what's the next thing that they're going to be angry about that is going to erupt into a global war. So for that reason, we reject the Treaty of Versailles, and that's going to shape our identity and our view of the world for the next 15 to 20 years until World War II begins in Europe again. And finally, U.S. participation in World War II transformed American society, while the victory of the United States and its allies over the Axis powers vaulted the U.S. into a position of global political and military leadership. So again, entering into the war, this was slightly different than in World War I, because there was a clear consensus that the United States should defend itself and should make Japan answer for their attack on Pearl Harbor. And because we had a preparedness movement going on as the war became more imminent, it allowed for the United States for a quicker entry. into the war. We were already helping with Great Britain with the Lend-Lease Act and the cash and carry, so we were already making war materials, and we were more ready to start fighting the war. The operations in the Pacific of island hopping, the D-Day invasion on Normandy, and the Manhattan Project all worked through U.S. leadership. Yes, there were Australian forces helping us in the island hopping, and D-Day was a joint effort between us, Britain, and Canada, but it was Dwight D. Eisenhower, the general, American general, who was in charge of the operation. And for the Manhattan Project, we had British scientists and American scientists, and also some refugee scientists from areas that had been taken over by Nazi Germany, helping in this project. But again, it was based in the United States in Los Alamos, New Mexico. And so the United States was really getting comfortable in a leadership position, which is going to shape how we act and our identity at the end of the war. We're going to be committed to global cooperation after the war. At the Yalta Conference and then finally at the Potsdam Conference, there are plans for a post-war world in which the United States is going to be more involved. There's a plan for a United Nations. Later on, we're going to create the Marshall Plan that's going to give money and aid and supplies to countries in Europe that have been affected by the war and are willing to keep communism out of their governments. And that was it. So here's our recap. The United States economy continued to experience boom and bust cycles though beginning to implement reforms in the progressive era. Internal migration was fueled by discrimination and the Great Depression. International migration was further restricted by the Quota Acts. The New Deal attempts to curb unemployment, creates a social safety net for Americans. The Spanish-American War proves America's place as a world power. We entered World War I reluctantly, and then we reverted to isolationism at its conclusion. And then finally, we entered World War II over Pearl Harbor. And at the end of the war, we accept the role of world leader at the end. So that is how American identity has shifted all through historical period 7. Thank you for watching. I know this one was kind of long, and I can't wait to see you back for period 8.